the North Koreans are inserted into Russian units and they're given Russian uniforms, Russian equipment, so they can't easily be identified as North Koreans. But obviously, they're speaking different languages. The radio intercepts are making clear that they're North Koreans, and visually, you can see that some are North Koreans, whereas compared to ethnic Russians. Now, they do seem to be quite well trained troops and physically fit. This is what the lieutenant colonel was telling me. And they're good at kind of clearing houses and establishing positions inside villages, but they really have no ability to deal with the modern nature of warfare. They just don't understand that they're being spied on from the sky at all times. They're still hiding in tree lines and not realizing they can be recognized with thermal imaging cameras, and they're being taken out quite easily by drones as a result of that and suffering very heavy casualties. They also need to have Russian guides who are attached to them to show them where to go and help them interpret their surroundings, because it's so different from anything that they've ever seen in North Korea. And this unit had captured one of the Russian guides who was providing a lot of detailed information to the Ukrainians about how they work together.
So, Maxim, I just want to talk about your latest report, a recent report you've done. You've obtained the first account by Ukrainian forces of close quarters fighting with North Korean troops inside Russia. Who did you speak to and where were they?
I spoke to the 33rd Separate Assault Brigade. They're known as the Big Cats, and they were fighting in a village called Makhnovka in the Kursk region. And this was actually a really important strategic battle because it's a place where if the North Koreans and the Russians had been able to take hold of that village, they could push on to Sudzha, the largest town that Ukraine has been able to occupy in Russia, and effectively cut off the Ukrainian advance deeper into the Kursk region. Recently, Ukraine has reinforced its efforts in Kursk and has attempted to take more territory inside Kursk, again as part of this attempt to have a better negotiating position when it comes to peace talks with Putin. And if some of those are the best equipped brigades, that they are the best trained units that are pushing forward into Kursk, and if they'd been cut off and the North Koreans had got in behind them, then it would have been really difficult for the Ukrainians to escape from that.
And you spoke in particular to Lieutenant Colonel Leopard, as you write his name being. Can you tell me a little bit more about him?
That's his call sign. So he's a senior commander in this battalion, and he is coordinating different units. We're using different advanced technologies. It's become a war of technology now. The Russians are increasingly using first-person view drones with fiber optic, very kind of thin fiber optic cables attached to them, so that they can negate the Ukrainian jamming, and that's proving quite effective and difficult for the Ukrainians to deal with. So the Russian FPV drones have a fiber optic cable attached to them, which defeats the Ukrainian jamming, and so that's giving the Russians an advantage in the air. In Makhnovka, it was interesting because the North Koreans were attacking, but they don't seem to have drone capabilities. They're not equipped to use drones. And this lieutenant colonel was telling me that in the fighting inside that village, the Ukrainians were able to have the upper hand because they were in the air above the North Koreans, and the North Koreans didn't really know how to deal with these drones. The North Koreans were also walking forwards in single file into minefields, and people were being taken out by these mines, and the North Koreans would just carry on marching past them with paramedics dragging them off the battlefield, the wounded off the battlefield.
It's really interesting when you're talking to somebody of that professionalism. How do they react when they're describing the way they're seeing the North Koreans basically being thrown into the field and allowed to die in that way?
Well, I think at this point in the war, 3 years on, a lot of people, men like him, are very matter of fact about the nature of death and killing. It's been going on for so long. I mean, I think there is still, some element of horror about how needlessly lives are being thrown away, and surprise still at the North Koreans that they're willing to sacrifice their soldiers in a very alien land, which has really very little benefit to them in doing so. Um, and the lack of concern for the soldiers that the Russians are commanding is clear, and there is some shock within the Ukrainian ranks about that, but they're getting increasingly used to it.
And why would there be such efforts to conceal the fact that they are North Koreans?
I think for Putin, it's still quite embarrassing that he has to rely on another nation to defend Russian borders, and they're trying to minimize the images that get out around the world and inside Russia for the purposes that it doesn't suit his propaganda narrative that he is the guy that guarantees Russia's security. Um, of course, inevitably, people are starting to be captured. We've seen two North Koreans captured and paraded on Ukrainian television. So it is getting out anyway, and some of that will probably start to permeate into Russia. That they're having to rely on North Korea for their own defense.
And what have you learnt about the North Korean soldiers opting to not be taken alive?
So there's probably considerable pressure on North Koreans not to be captured because of repercussions for their families back home and anything that the regime, Pyongyang regime, would do to their families if they are allowed themselves to be captured alive. And there have been stories about Russians executing wounded North Koreans, North Korean officers executing their own wounded soldiers rather than try and retrieve them or allow them to be captured. Um, but inevitably, the nature of warfare is such that people get wounded and surprised and surrounded, and there have been these two prisoners of war at least so far, and I think we can expect to see more. And it will become increasingly difficult and ineffective to use those methods to try and hide the fact that North Korean troops are fighting inside Russia.
And in the case of this village, which you write about, Makhnovka, what's the situation now? And can you describe how the North Koreans were routed?
So yes, so the North Koreans had set up three machine gun positions inside this village, and they were trying to control the area using these positions, and they fortified the areas, and they came in by surprise. They'd flanked the Ukrainian units who weren't ready for them at the time. So this 33rd Separate Assault Brigade had to go in and clear them out in house-to-house fighting. They did do that, and obviously with the help of drones, which the North Koreans weren't using, that gave them an advantage. They also had the Ukrainians had tanks and armored personnel carriers, which they deployed inside the village, and they were able to drive out the North Koreans and hold on to the village. Now, the fighting in that village has been very fierce over the past couple of days. The lieutenant colonel said to me that in 2 days he saw 120 North Korean Russian troops killed. In one incident, he said he saw in the space of 4 minutes about 15 North Korean troops killed by drone. So it was a very intensive battle. And after that, the Russians and North Koreans seem to have been driven out of the village, and they are not making any more attempts to take that village. And there have been radio intercepts from Russian officers suggesting that the North Koreans are not prepared to go back and try and take that village again.
And at the moment in Kursk on the ground, there isn't that much movement, though, is there?
There's been some movement of the Ukrainians trying to push further into Kursk, and there was reinforcements in an effort to do that. It hasn't got as far as the Ukrainians would have hoped, but a lot of what is happening there is still quite unclear. Um, the Russians launched a counter-offensive to try and cut off the Ukrainians and put pressure on the units that are being reinforced. So there is still a lot of heavy fighting, but yes, as ever in this war, it's increasingly difficult to make territorial gains because as soon as you come out into the open, you're exposed to drones and you're exposed to artillery, and it's very, very difficult to make gains in the current environment, especially when it's so cold.
And we talked before about the importance of holding on to at least part of Kursk as leverage for any ceasefire talks that might take place. How aware was the commander that you spoke to of how his particular operation fits into the bigger picture and the objectives?
I think when we spoke, he was tired. He had a limited amount of time because he had to go back to the front in a few hours' time. And he's really thinking about the daily grind, the job that they're doing in the field and the job that they're doing in the trenches, how to protect his men better, how to give them an advantage on the battlefield, how to spot the kind of technology that the Russians are using and overcome it. And his particular specialism is communication. So he's trying to ensure that every single Ukrainian soldier in his unit has secure internet wherever they are on the battlefield so that they can send secure communications and that they can get kind of good maps of the area and see where the Russians are, can get drone feeds that will help them with their mission. While the Russians are obviously trying to jam that internet, he's trying to jam the Russian internet at the same time, and each side is playing a cat and mouse game where they're trying to hit each other's electronic warfare equipment or hit each other's communications equipment with missiles. And so it's a kind of intense game where he's got to use his brain a lot and focus a lot on that.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.